Hey folks, Tim here.
And Rachel.
Before we get started with this week's episode, we have some big first reading podcast news to share with you.
Yes, we do. Longtime fans of the podcast will know that we are nearing the 3-year anniversary of first reading, which means we have gone through the entire lectionary cycle and we've built up an amazing community of listeners and guest scholars.
And as we look together at the future of the podcast, we both felt that it was the right time to grow and to include some new voices. So, drumroll please, we are adding a third regular co-host to our team.
We are, and I am stoked. We are so proud to add to our lineup our friend and colleague and former guest on the podcast, Rosy Kandathil. You will probably remember Rosy from our recent episode on the Book of Esther. She's a doctoral candidate in Hebrew Bible at Emory University, an adjunct instructor at Emory College of Arts and Sciences, and just an amazing person in general.
And friends, you're in for a treat because Rosy starts with us today.
Ta-da!
She's co-hosting this week's episode with Rachel for a deep dive into the Book of Ruth. And each week that follows will feature a different tag team of 2 out of the 3 of us.
Though we'll all 3 get together every once in a while for a party episode.
We've been working on this. What?
A party episode. Just make me laugh.
That's exactly what it is, right? We've been working on this whole thing behind the scenes for a while, so we're both really excited to make this announcement now. Mm-hmm. And anyway, that means I'm done for today.
Hey, enjoy the time off.
I'll hand it over to Rachel and Rosy for this week's episode. So without further ado, let's get to it. Cue the music.
Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament Lectionary podcast, inspiring confident preaching from the Hebrew Bible. I'm Dr. Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary.
And I'm Rosy Kandathil, a PhD candidate at Emory University.
Yay! Your first official episode! It's so exciting!
Yay! I can't wait to have this conversation. The first reading for November 7th, 2021 includes a smattering of texts from the Book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, and chapter 4, verses 13 to 17 to be exact. To help us think through these texts for today, we have a special guest who's thought a lot about the Book of Ruth and about, well, most of the texts that have to do with women in the Bible.
That's right. With us today is Ashley Wilcox, a Quaker minister and the author of The Women's Lectionary, Preaching the Women of the Bible Throughout the Year, a handbook for feminist preachers. She also founded Preaching with Confidence, an online preaching class and preaching coaching organization. Ashley travels around the country to speak and preach. She has been teaching and leading workshops on women and spirituality for more than a decade. You can connect with her at ashleymwilcox.com. We are thrilled to have her with us today. Ashley Wilcox, welcome to First Reading.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, we typically start with about the same question every time. How did you get into the field of ministry and writing books on the Bible and preaching?
So I became a Quaker while I was in law school.
Oh.
Yeah, which was not what I expected, but I was really unhappy when I was in law school and I was looking for a church community and I found Quakers. And so really in my first few years of working as a lawyer, I experienced this call to ministry that was profound and scary. And I was really drawn to preaching. Like I had this sense of myself as a preacher, even though at that point I was in a tradition that didn't have very much preaching, at least the part I was in. And so I wanted to go to seminary to learn about that and to find some skills to have sustainable ministry. And then for the past 5 years, I've been working with Ted Smith as part of the teaching team for the intro preaching class.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this project on the Women's Lectionary? Tell us how you came up with the idea, how you worked on it, and how you focused on these particular characters.
Yeah, at the time I was pastoring a church that I co-founded called Church of Mary Magdalene, and this was my first time as a weekly preacher. I'd done a lot of preaching before that, but it was always a one-off or an occasional, once a month maybe. And it's so different. Like you really have to think about continuity when you're in the same community preaching each week. And so like many preachers, I fell back on the Revised Common Lectionary to find my texts because I really liked the community. I liked that it took me in different places. And all of the resources for the RCL. But I also really wanted to preach on women, and a lot of weeks there aren't passages on women in the RCL. And so I was talking about this with my partner one weekend. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and we were driving, and I was saying how I loved the resources in the community of the RCL, but I really wanted to preach on women. And he was like, well, why don't you just write your own lectionary?
Like one does, right?
Yeah, no big deal.
And you were like, I'll do that.
Yeah, I'd like to also mention that he's in tech. Like he is not in this field. But I thought it was a really cool idea. And so I spent the rest of that holiday weekend just putting together a calendar of readings to see if I could come up with a full year of 2 readings per Sunday and holiday on women in the Bible and feminine images of God. It's like a puzzle. So it was great because I was in the church, preaching regularly then. And so I would do the exegesis for the week for my sermon and then turn that into a commentary.
I can't wait. Yeah, I know it's out there and it's available and folks can get it. And I haven't gotten my hands on a copy yet, but I'm super excited to see it.
I can't wait to see it in pulpits. It's going to be great.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so that's great. So we've gotten through those questions. And
Good transition.
Ashley, we're so happy you could be with us here today. And why don't you start us off by reading the assigned text for today?
So our text for today is Ruth 3, 1 through 5, and 4, 13 to 17. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David.
The word of the Lord. It's such a good text. And I feel like this happens almost every time on this podcast where it gets read out loud. And then again, I hear something new that I hadn't paid attention to before. But before we dive straight into the exegesis, let's kind of do a broader scope context of the book. So for folks who might not be more familiar with the Book of Ruth in the parish, some preachers might have to do like a 2-minute sketch at the beginning of their sermon. So could you give us just a 2-minute summary of the book, of what happens?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So at the center of the Book of Ruth are these 2 women, Ruth and Naomi. And the book starts with Naomi and her husband leaving Israel. This is during the time of the Judges, and there's a famine, and so they go to Moab, and they have 2 sons. And so their 2 sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then Naomi's husband dies, and both of her sons die. She's lost all of the men in her family, and she decides to go back to her home. her two daughters-in-law start going with her, and she tells them, go back to your people. I have nothing to give you. And Orpah does, but Ruth says, no, I'm going with you, in this beautiful speech that you so often hear in weddings of, where you go, I will go, your people will be my people. And one of the things I like to say about Ruth is it's one of the books that makes the Bible pass the Bechdel test.
Nice.
You actually have two women talking to each other, and not about a man. And so these two women go back together. They're committing to each other, and they need some form of support. And so Naomi has a relative, Boaz. They go back to her hometown, and Ruth goes out into the fields gleaning after the harvest, getting their food that way. And Boaz makes sure that she is with his women and protected from the men that might bother her there. And then when this is getting into where we are today, the harvest is coming. And so this gleaning season is ending. And so they need a new form of support. And so Naomi comes up with this plan for Ruth to marry Boaz, and that will be their means of support.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it comes in the time of the Judges. What might it be important to know about the Book of Judges that it'd be helpful to know for preaching this text?
So the Book of Judges is an interesting one for women. There are some very strong women in there. In particular, you have Deborah and Jael and Delilah. And as you progress through the Book of Judges, things get worse and worse in general, but especially for women, ending with some real gender-based violence, and it's really hard. So you have this story of two women in Ruth who are trying to stay safe and find protection in a time when that was not always the case. Women didn't always have safety or protection.
Yeah. It's almost like that first line that this is in the days when the judges ruled, to us is just kind of like, oh, said in the days of Judges. But to ancient audiences, it would be like danger sign for women. Like this is not going to end well. I always feel like the Book of Judges is like one of those movies where you get to the end of it, it's like, why did I just watch that? Why did I spend 2 hours of my life to feel worse?
So you already just started talking about the kind of protection that they might be looking about and thinking about. And so the first thing that kind of comes up in chapter 1, and you read in the NRSV this word security. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what these women are looking for. And that word appears earlier in the text in chapter 1, verse 9. When Naomi tries to let her daughters-in-law off the hook and just say, why don't you stick around here and make your way and find security somewhere else? Can you say a little bit more about that word and how you see that word functioning in this section?
Yeah, I love, Rachel pointed this out, how the word can mean security or rest. And like you can't rest unless you are secure. You have to be in a place of safety before you can rest. And so if she is in her father's house with her people or with a husband, she can be secure and to rest. But outside of that protection, there is no space for her to rest.
Right. You're painting a real picture of insecurity there, right, for those two women. So in chapter 2, we're starting with this barley threshing floor scene. How do you see this functioning in terms of the setting for what's going on and what's going on in terms of the festival? Because that's going to be part of the background for the next part.
Yeah, something that I thought was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this more later, is that the threshing floor is associated with sex work or prostitution. And you see this in Hosea 9:1. I'll just read it. Do not rejoice, O Israel, do not exult as other nations do, for you have played the whore, departing from your God. You have loved a prostitute's pay on all the threshing floors.
I never made that association.
It paints a pretty stark picture then for what Naomi instructs Ruth to do. You know, what is she actually asking Ruth to do?
I think this is a place where you can read it in a lot of different ways. And there are so many double meanings in the words in this passage that we would not necessarily recognize. One of the things about the anointing is a woman anointing herself could either come at the end of a grieving period or right before she's going to be married. And so in Ruth's case, she's doing both. Like, she's finishing grieving her husband who has died, and she is going out to find her next husband.
Wow.
There might be a temptation to talk about Naomi putting Ruth in this dangerous situation, which she is, but it's important to remember they're already in a very dangerous situation. And, you know, Ruth being a single woman out in the fields, if she didn't have the protection of these other women, like, she would be open to sexual assault, potentially rape, being bothered by the men. And Naomi is asking Ruth to go out on the threshing floor. She says to Ruth, don't be known to him. You know, known in a biblical sense is one of the double meanings until he is, you know, eaten and drunk and had all his sleeping there, and then uncover his feet, which is another.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Right. This story, the whole book of Ruth, but especially this moment, reminds me so much of the Tamar and Judah episode in Genesis, where there is all of this innuendo and nothing outright stated. So with kind of that background in mind, why don't you talk about what it means to uncover one's feet in the Bible?
I mean, I'm sure you both know that feet is a euphemism for genitalia, and we find this in the laws of not uncovering a close relative, which is not having sex with a close relative. And so to uncover feet is a pretty blatant description.
When Boaz had eaten and drunk and was in a contented mood, the Hebrew there is fantastic. It's when his heart was pleasured, when his heart was happy, when his heart was good. And, you know, heart is like this central area in your chest. So it's like when he had a good buzz going, you know, when he was merry. He goes and lays down, and then verse 8, he turns over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. And one of my students who was translating this was like, well, did he just like feel a draft? And because his feet were uncovered, it woke him up?
Before we get too far into that, going back to Ruth and Naomi, you know, Naomi says all of these things. She has this plan. She tells Ruth what to do. And Ruth says, all that you tell me, I will do. Like, there's some real agency here for both of these women. You know, she's not commanding her to do this. Ruth agrees to it. Just by contrast, going back to the book of Judges, like comparing this with the story of Samson's wife. Samson gets married to this woman and then abandons her, and his wife is given to his best man. And then he comes back around a little while later and is like, I want my wife. And her father says, well, she's married to this other man now. Here's her sister. And so like giving away women is part of the context of this. And so to have these two women who are talking about what they want, agreeing to it, having this agency to put the plan into action is a real contrast.
I think it is a contrast, and I think there's layers of ambiguity even in that contrast as well. I mean, I could imagine being someone who had been in a sort of elder-younger relationship that was not the healthiest, reading this text and being like, did Ruth have that much agency to say no? You know, I think there's so many layers of consent, and I think maybe one of our preaching pitfalls for this text would be to lean too far in either direction on that, to, you know, naming this as completely supporting women's agency or completely taking it away. I think there's, like most areas in life, especially when it's an issue of survival, you know, this is not just an issue of thriving, this is an issue of survival. And so those layers get really gray and really ambiguous. What do y'all think about that?
It's really helpful to kind of to think that there might be different sides as well. And as you pointed out, Ashley, too, it's rare when we see two women negotiating power. Yeah. And so that was really helpful in what you're saying. But it's worth talking about, you know, how we negotiate uncomfortable conversations. Like, how are we going to get through this really hard situation together? And here's a plan. Okay, we'll try it.
And I mean, these women, at least as far as I read, do have a relationship built on trust, not an abusive kind of mother relationship like we see in some of the other texts. And so I agree with you, like there is a lot of ambiguity in this, and you can read it in a lot of different ways.
It's also my culture, right? So I'm also thinking intergenerationally of the kinds of power that elder women hold in my community. And so I'm glad we're having this discussion, because depending on who's in your congregation, you might have a gamut of experiences between older women who have been either supportive, mentoring, offering good advice, and then older women that have been less so, who have, maybe wanted to overwrite their daughters' lives or their younger women in their lives because of choices that they've made. So, I mean, the mix of those experiences, it's a temptation, I think, to just say, oh, when we see two women together, it's something to celebrate. But there's, there's mixed experiences in our pews. So it's valuable to kind of acknowledge that not everybody has had positive experiences of female friendship.
Absolutely. And I mean, we can't forget that this is Naomi protecting herself as well. She is giving Ruth so that she will have security.
Yeah.
Oh, such a good point. Yeah.
And that's actually, this whole conversation about the relationship between Ruth and Naomi leads us into an interesting place in chapter 4, where there's also an interesting presentation about Ruth and Naomi's relationship. Maybe we'll put a pin in that, though, because there's this really complicated legal scene that happens in between those two. Ashley, Rosy, you're both lawyers, trained lawyers. Like, take it away. Talk about the legal aspects of this story.
I was super excited that Ashley was like, yeah, I want to talk about the legal stuff. I mean, it's a pretty prominent part of this narrative. The narrator spends a lot of time talking about the ins and outs of levirate marriage and law. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and help our preachers to think about that background? And if they're interested, to preach a little bit about it.
So levirate marriage is like one of my small obsessions in my book. Honestly, like I talk about it all the time. And part of it is because it helps to frame what patriarchy is, like what this patriarchal system is, and then potentially gets rid of it later on in the Bible. And I'm just like, this is kind of a key to my understanding of the Bible and patriarchy and women's role in this. The law of levirate marriage comes from Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. And so this is the law that if a man dies with no son, his brother shall marry his widow, and their firstborn will carry on the name of the man who died. There are at least two purposes of levirate marriage. One is to continue the man's name, which is basically, their version of the afterlife of carrying on the family name. And to protect the widow, to make sure that this woman who is part of the family but doesn't have a man to protect her has this protection from the brother. And so I started seeing this throughout the Bible. Rachel, you mentioned earlier the levirate marriage in Tamar, the story of Tamar, and this is in Genesis 38. And so to boil down a very long, complicated story, after Tamar's father-in-law, Judah, brother of Joseph, refused to give her in marriage to his third son after the first two sons die. Tamar tricks him into having sex with her and impregnating her because he won't follow the law. And when he finds out what she's done, he says, she's more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son.
Well, and that word is actually righteousness. It's actually tzedakah. She is more righteous than I. Like, it's a big ticket moment.
Yeah, she's righteous. And so when we read these stories, they may seem like ethically odd or, have some kind of sexual deviance to them, but really Tamar and then Ruth are following this law and trying to perpetuate the family line in the way that they know about. going on to Ruth, one of the commentaries I read said that she had to nudge Boaz into following this law. He wasn't quite doing the right thing, which I actually disagree with. And my background in law is in appellate law, so it's applying law to fact patterns, which is exactly what this is. And so the kind of complicated legal issue in the middle that we skip over is that there is a kinsman redeemer who is closer than Boaz. And so really this other man should be taking the field, redeeming the field and then marrying Ruth, but he hasn't. And so once Ruth essentially proposes to Boaz, he's like, okay, but there's someone else who is first in line before me. And so he goes to that other man, and first he's like, do you want this field? And the man's like, sure. And then he's like, and there's the wife that comes along with it.
Right.
Says, no, I don't want that. And so they clear out the person who is first in line, and then Boaz is free to marry Ruth.
It's so cool because in that scene too, I noticed that the man that's closer, the kinsperson, is like, I'd rather not have the wife because it'll mess with my property, transmission. So it's a very strategic way that Boaz sets up the conversation, because he could have started off with the wife, but he starts out with the property, draws him in, and then says, also there's this woman.
Right. Yeah. And part of that is that the property will go to the son and be part of the inheritance of this previous husband, because that's how levirate marriage works.
Right. Well, and it's a fascinating discussion too, both in Tamar's story and here of these women who are forced to force the men to act in a righteous way and are both foreign. So, I think that almost brings us nicely to the end of the story too, because as a foreigner, it's almost like Ruth can't be given too much credit because she just sort of fades away at the end of the story. Naomi takes on her son Obed as kind of a nursemaid, which is beautiful. But even like the neighbor women are the ones who name him, and Ruth just sort of fades. So what do you make of that, Ashley?
Yeah, I think it makes sense in the context of the book as a whole, because it starts with Naomi. Naomi and her husband, and then Naomi's loss. And really in the first chapter, Naomi is like a Job figure. She has lost everything, and she is bitter. She is, saying that God has forsaken her. Like, it is a really intense passage. And so then you have this restoration at the end, also similar to the book of Job, I think, where you don't actually get back what you lost, but something else restores that. And I think this makes sense in the context of levirate marriage as well, because the son that is born to Ruth is Naomi's grandson, because he is the son of her husband who died. And so a son has been born to her after she lost her sons and potential grandchildren. I also think this question about the women naming the child, I don't know why they do that. It seems kind of strange, but it does seem like they are bringing Naomi and Ruth fully into the community, that this community of women is accepting them and naming the child and celebrating with them.
I'm glad you brought out the image of all the women together. It actually, oddly, just immediately the image of the Song of the Sea with all the women dancing at the end with Miriam. Suddenly, I kind of saw like a group of women, kind of coming together and saying, here is this miracle. And I think of all the barren women in our texts and in the Old Testament, where there's this moment of resurrection, something has been redeemed in their lives by having this child. But it is so hard to watch a foreign woman getting erased at the end after seeing Ruth be so instrumental in the salvation of this small family. So, and it's also hard to then see that the last word is these women are important because they're David's ancestors. And so their stories don't stand alone. It's that they have been instrumental in birthing this very important figure that then, then you sort of see, oh, that's why that's why these women are here. So in that way, it's like a mixed feeling where I'm like, yay. And also, ooh.
Yeah. And again, I feel like that's one of the big strengths of the Book of Ruth is that it resists being a Disney movie and it resists hopelessness. It kind of resists both of those poles at the same time. And it exists in this area where there's just, you cannot solve it. Or maybe you hear the book differently depending on your life situation.
Yeah, it's complex. And going to the family line part, they explicitly name Tamar in this passage, which I find really fascinating.
Right. Great point. Great point.
And hope that Ruth's family and Naomi's family will be like the house of Tamar. And I think in both the case of Tamar and Ruth, like if the women didn't do the particular thing they do, the line would not have continued. Like they are the ones who are responsible for continuing this family line.
Right. Yeah. No,
they've earned their place in the canon. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying is, it's actually a way of highlighting their contribution. Like had it not been for their agency.
Yeah.
Well, and perhaps, so I'm leery of the fact that as a white woman, like I want this to be happy ending, right? So I just want to name that fact that I think I'm leaning in that direction.
Yeah. It's not just white, it's American, as I think one of the things is Americans lean into this happy ending. Whereas I think myself being Indian American, I have this side where I feel like like you said, Rachel, you're looking for also the sorrow, the line of darkness in this tale, and acknowledging that our congregations are mixed, or hopefully are have mixed experiences of these, or have had experiences in other countries, and can kind of see that the American tradition is kind of to lean into the happy ending, but to acknowledge that there's a lot of sadness in this book, a lot of hard stuff.
Well, I think we've hit a bunch of the preaching pitfalls. Should we transition to the preaching angles? Ashley, do you have any ideas to throw out there about how you might preach this text?
Sure. I mean, one of my primary things is always to tell the story. So often in our congregations, people aren't familiar with these stories, or they've heard a very sanitized version of them. Ruth is one of those places where you get children's stories about it, and like actually drawing out this language in the text is important. And I think breathes new life into a story that may seem very familiar. But the other place that I just feel drawn to in this is how the people are turning toward each other and connecting with each other and making safe spaces for each other, of Ruth and Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and then bringing Naomi and Ruth into this community of women. There's a lot of people creating a place of security, like we started with, where there wouldn't necessarily be one.
Rosy, how about you? What do you see as preaching angles here?
I think based on our conversation, I'm really drawn to this idea of a community of people, both in terms of acknowledging the grief and the kinds of different ways that we cooperate to help each other survive. And then also the ways that we celebrate, because even in that last image of the women, there's a recognition of what Naomi and Ruth have survived. And that they've barely survived, right? And they're not completely out of the woods either. There's just sort of a little bit of light here at the end. And so for me, just being able to say, all of us have lived through something really difficult in this pandemic. And that there are things to celebrate and things to really mourn in this moment. But to not lose sight of either of those. Like Rachel was saying, this is a story of both hope and despair. And, that they're both in here. This tension is this is what makes this text so rich. The Bible in general is so rich. And these stories about women in particular, because they're often about surviving. And we've gone through a national, international moment of survival.
Yeah. It makes me think especially too of the data about the number of women who have either given up work or have lost their jobs. And
it's a moment of adult faith formation, like in so many ways. All the angles that we're talking about is, it's adult. It's not the cleaned up children's literature version of Ruth, but we're really inviting folks into the rated R version, NC-17, like this is what real life looks like. It's messy, it's icky, it's fuzzy.
Messy, icky, fuzzy. Yeah. It's a great article. Rhiannon Graybills does a fantastic job. So the two preaching angles that I came up with, the first one is I would just love to hear preachers, even especially male preachers, spend a significant time in their sermon talking about women's relationships and talking about women's friendships. And preacher friends out there, if you're a guy and you don't feel like you identify as a guy, you don't feel like you really understand that, talk to the women in your life. Talk to the women and see what sort of sermon illustrations come up from asking them, what are your friendships with other women like? And how do you experience friendships between women being portrayed in the media? And then use that as an in to this conversation, to this book. So I think that's the one beginning, maybe sermon illustration that I throw out there. The other thing that kept floating through my mind as we were talking is, who is capable of acting on behalf of God's justice? We talked about Tamar and we talked about Ruth, and they're both women. They're both widows, and they're both foreigners. They are as far to the margin just about as you can get in a society. And I know a fair number of churches in my tradition, in the Lutheran tradition, who really like to preach on justice. And sometimes I wonder, how able are we to actually see justice if we are the people of power in our community? And I wonder what a sermon would look like which asks folks who care deeply about God's justice, which asks them to reflect on who is teaching them about God's justice. Because I feel like the slippery place we fall into is when we think we know what God's justice is. As soon as we feel like we're on certain ground, we start to slip a little bit if we're the people in power. Who are you listening to who is actually teaching you about God's justice? Who's someone on the margin rather than those folks who are just in the center? So I don't know if you could do much with that, but that's what kept coming to me as I was thinking about these women and the testimony that they have.
Another thing that I think about a lot in this text is the earlier group of women, the women who are in the fields with Ruth that she is gleaning with. And part of that is I just see such a connection between that and the Me Too movement, because women talk to each other, especially when there aren't structures that are protecting them from men who could hurt them. They talk to each other about who's a good man, how to stay safe, all of that stuff. And so I see Ruth getting protection there, but also those women would have talked about Boaz because they worked with him.
Right.
So,
right.
we don't have that in the text, but I think I can read it in pretty easily.
I love that. Yeah. And I love the idea too, that there are these unseen portions of the Bible. I mean, they're there, but they're veiled. You have to kind of look to see, but you can see now these women bent together, working side by side, and sharing survival information, stuff that, would be invaluable. It's sharing life together. Fabulous. We're at the end. I'm so sorry. We could keep talking all day, I think. But Ashley Wilcox, thank you so much for being our guest today and helping illuminate this beautiful passage and give preachers what they need for the next few weeks to just be thinking about.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Well, folks, if you liked what you heard this week, there's plenty more over at our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. You can subscribe to the podcast there or wherever you listen. We post each episode on Facebook every week, so you can listen and share there as well. If you have found First Reading helpful, please do take a minute to spread the word. Many thanks to Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University for a grant that helps us sustain the podcast. Thanks also to Blue Dot Sessions for the music behind the reading, and to Tim McNinch for producing First Reading. Thanks to you also for listening. Until next time, I'm Dr. Rachel Wren.
And I'm Rosy Kandathil. Thanks for listening.